Hi everybody, this is Mr. V. I'm an AP Environmental Science teacher and I'm here to kind of give you a little outline of what's going to be on the AP Environmental exam and what you should be expecting throughout the year. So a little bit about the APES exam so you know what it's all going to have in front of you. This is a year-long course and it basically deals with the interrelationships within the natural world. So there's going to be a lot of focus on not just the natural world, but how people interact with that natural world. And we have to also provide an analysis of what problems humans have been causing. This whole course is based on the connection between humans and the natural world and how, in fact, that's going to play a big role in how the environment deals with itself and its natural organization. So the big thing that has changed in the APES exam is going to be that it's not only going to be about the problems, but resolving and preventing those problems. That's something that is not so much new, but a bigger focus now in the AP exam. So not only will you need to know a problem like climate change or water pollution, you'll also be expected to provide ways to solve that problem and prevent that problem, or a word you'll learn later on as we go through the course is mitigating that problem. So that's something that's going to be big in the next few months of AP exam. And so when we look at these problems, one of the things that you're going to see is that APES is not a course that's just by itself when it comes to topics. It's going to be a course about geology, biology, chemistry. And so that's why College Board doesn't really recommend that you take this as a freshman. They expect you to have, hopefully, a year of life science, which typically is biology, physical science, which usually tends to be chemistry, and then at least 1 year of algebra, because unfortunately, as some of us will not be happy about, all science does require math. So that's something that is going to be a consideration that you'll have to have when you're taking this course and getting ready for it. And so here's the big ideas. The course is outlined to make sure that you understand that everything falls under these four main topics, right? The first one is energy and interactions, and basically getting an idea of how the Earth and processes end up kind of being moved by energy. Okay, so that's going to be a big deal there. And of course, that's going to be having to do a little bit of chemistry with your laws of thermodynamics. Then, of course, there's also the interactions between the Earth and the idea that it's all interconnected systems. So the big term here is the biogeochemical cycles. That's something that's new. You may have studied that in biology, or you may have learned the chemicals in chemistry, but here we're going to actually understand the big idea of how these cycles change over time. Some of them go very slowly, like the phosphorus cycle. Others go very, very quickly, like the water cycle or even the carbon cycle. Could be considered quick if you're not talking historical carbon. And of course, the big idea, EIN, that's going to be your human interactions, right? How do we deal with the natural systems? What's our technology doing? Our population numbers? You know, I would argue that the population here is probably the biggest issue that has to be dealt with when it comes to the cause of all of our environmental problems. So, you know, others may argue other things, but the fact that there are so many of us ends up being a big issue here. Then, of course, you have sustainability, which is achieving sustainable systems, making sure that people can develop and manage those things. And of course, the cultural and social and even economic impacts. This is a weird science course because there's not just science. You have math, you have different forms of science, and now you've also got, you also have to deal with cultural and social issues, which we'll examine quite a bit throughout the course. Now the format for the exam, this has changed. So if you are challenging the test from a previous year, or if you had just heard of how this test used to be, this has changed now. So now the course itself is actually not going to be as long as it was, the exam. See, previously it was only, it was an hour and a half. So they've shaved a few minutes off of this. So that's a good thing. And then the other things you're going to notice too is that this course used to have 100 multiple choice questions and now it only has 80. So that's a positive. And there's only 3 free response questions. The reason for this is because College Board found that Some of the courses, some of the questions in previous exams were a little bit redundant in testing the skills. So now they've designed it so you can see specifically what you're going to be doing. So question 1 will always be the same, and it will always be design and investigation. That's new. The AP exam had not had many of those in previous years, so your teachers will probably have some issues trying to figure how that works, but it will be something that we're all going to be figuring out together because it is new. Then, of course, you have the typical free response, which is analyzing an environmental problem, but here's the big deal: proposing a solution. That's going to be the new thing. And then, of course, analyzing an environmental problem and doing a solution as well, but here it is, the math, the calculations. So it's been rearranged a little bit, and I think for the benefit. So this should make the exam a little better. And the thing you're going to notice also is that there are only going to be 4 choices in the multiple choice. That's a change. It used to be that it was 5 choices, which made it a little more confusing, but that's actually been reduced, so that's a helpful thing for us. So a little bit of background information. The thing you have to understand is environmental science is not environmentalism. As much as we would love, and many of us are environmentalists, it's not something that we're focusing on here, right? So Rachel Carson was a marine biologist, very famous. She wrote the book Silent Spring, which led to many, we think, movements in the environmental movement. So basically she ended up comparing DDT to what was very scary to people at the time in 1962, which is nuclear weapons. So that spurred the environmental movement and got things going. So what you will notice, though, is that though we're not environmentalism, or we're not studying environmentalism, you're still studying many things out of the purview of typical science, right? So you see right here, economics, ethics, policy and law, literature. So it's not a bad thing to mention Rachel Carson or to look her up a little bit, but I highly doubt there will be questions asking you about why Rachel Carson was so important and so, fantastic. As much as you may agree, that's not something that they're going to be looking for in the AP exam. And so these are the science practices. I make sure to point these out because one of the things that College Board and the AP exam is going to be doing is they're not just testing how much knowledge you have. It's not a test based on how much do we remember of this thing and that thing, which is a good thing because the way it works, you're going to have these skills that you're going to see a lot of. And so you've got some big ones here where you have to explain concepts. That's a normal one that basically is your beginner topic, right? What you're going to see a lot of, and we've been seeing a lot of in the AP exam lately, is a lot of visual representations, right? The idea is you're going to see a lot of graphs, models, and charts and diagrams. The 2016 exam, which was the only release test to your AP teachers, has almost half or more than half of the exam that are models, charts, diagrams, and graphs. And then if you add in some math, that's way more than half. So there's going to be quite a bit of that. So be prepared. Some study guides and some study books out there may only have information questions. If they don't have a lot of questions with graphs, they're really not AP level. And of course, just simply having a graph is not AP level. It's being able to explain and interpret them. That's the big deal. And you're going to see how those kind of scaffold and they get more complicated as you go. And then there will be some text analysis that's not going to be explicitly tested, but you're going to have to be able to see a claim and evaluate if it's valid or not. If you can evaluate the validity of a conclusion, that's going to be something that's important. It's not going to be explicitly tested in part of their standards, but it will be on the test. And of course, we mentioned earlier, the new thing is experimentation. You're going to have a lot of that on the test. It may not be on the multiple choice, but it will definitely be its own free response now. And of course, along with number 2 and number 5, analyzing the data. So it's not just going to be looking at a graph or a diagram, but looking at the pattern and discussing what's going to happen. And of course, that impact on environmental issues. That's a big deal. And as I mentioned earlier, math is going to be a big deal and solutions. So these are the science practices that all of the questions are being written about that are being written on the AP exam are going to be focusing on. So, and then here are the 9 units, so you can see, and these are the percentages that you'll see them on the exam. These are again distributed in the free response and the multiple choice sections. So it's not specifically going to be all multiple choice for the living world, or all land and water use is going to be free response, or global change will only be free response. It'll be all over the exam, but you can see it's fairly evenly distributed. This actually usually tends to go together as one big topic, so that's why it may look like it's very small by showing it's 6 to 8%, but together that's a good up to 16% of the AP exam. So definitely something you don't want to avoid. And this tends to, this is actually the way the College Board has arranged the units from units 1 through 9. The reason for this is because I believe it looks more familiar to people. You start off with the stuff that we all know and love from biology, ecosystems, biodiversity, right? Everybody loves ecosystems, learning about different places the animals live and where they cohabitate and things like that. And then from biodiversity, then you start to get to the more unfamiliar topics like populations. Many of you, I'm sure, have taken Earth systems of some sort, plate tectonics, in junior high or middle school. What's different about that is you're also going to learn quite a bit in land and water about pesticides and agriculture. So that's something that is going to be new to you. And then, of course, we all know about pollution and both aquatic, including aquatic, terrestrial, and atmospheric, but not many of us have actually studied it. So that tends to be pretty new. And then, of course, we've all heard of climate change. That's the very big topic there at 15 to 20%, or global change. But it's not something that we hear about all the time. So at least not in detail. You hear about it when it comes to the news and people's opinions, but it's not something that you have heard the science of or may know the details of exactly. So that's a big chunk of the AP exam. And of course, that also includes a change in biodiversity too. So the first topic I want to just briefly discuss is the scientific method. Because the experimental design part is new on the AP exam, it's very important to understand that this is how the scientific method works. It's one of those skills that when you see things, that's the first step, observation, number one, seeing something. If I notice that there's a problem, then from there, I can make a hypothesis, which you all know, I'm sure, is the educated guess, right? That's how everyone sees it. Pardon my handwriting. And then the data collection is the big one. Actually, I'm going to erase that. That looks kind of bad. Sorry. But yes, so after data collection, you have results and interpretation. Then you get to discussion and conclusion. And of course, at that point, the great news about the scientific method is if you're wrong, you didn't do bad science. You just go back over here to the hypothesis step. And from there, you start again. And eventually, you can have a theory proposed, which is not like a theory where you're sitting around and I came up with an idea. That's different. A theory and an idea are not the same. A theory in the case of science is something that that the evidence is mainly pointing towards. And until there's some evidence against it, the theory is your best bet. So an example here that I'd like you to think about is if you were given a choice of seeds, right? If you were given bean seeds, or if you were given a type of radish or wildflower, right? If you're looking at those types of seeds, what would you want to test about them, right? You're used to, I'm sure, in chemistry and biology, of what I like to call cookie cutter labs. I'm not anti-cookie. I love cookies, clearly. But what we're talking about is a cookie cutter lab is something where you can pretty much follow the instructions, and then you know the step, and then after the step, the results are pretty much known. Your teacher generally gets that pretty clear, right? So that's not something that you got to be ready for when it comes to experimental design. The thing you have to ask yourself is, what have you observed seeds do, right? What have I observed that the seeds need? And then what happens if we change those conditions in the seed? If you can do that, so one of the things I have my students do is to think about what changes are occurring in the natural environment and human factors, and to test how the seed is going to respond to these. So you could think about seeds needing light, right? You could think about seeds needing, and we'll make a little bullet list here, right? Light. They obviously need water, okay? They'll need some level of nutrients of some kind. Usually this is in soil. Okay, and so changing some of those factors can lead to your experiment. And of course, if you don't want to change any of those factors, maybe you want to change something that affects those factors, right? If you want to add and think about pesticides, or in this case, an herbicide. Herbicide is something that kills plants. So that's some things to think about when you design an experiment. And so from there, here's an example thought process. So my observation is that drought takes away much of the water from the soil, clearly, right? And that certain chemicals or ions are needed and left behind. So that would be the big part of chemistry there. And so a lot of stuff that gets left behind is salt, NaCl or table salt. And so this is where you have the research step. You'll have to actually go and collect some information about salt and your type of plant that you're using and what is needed. The type of seed that you pick, that I pick in this scenario would be a pinto bean, right? So that's one of these things over here. And so the hypothesis from there is going to be where I think about the concentrations, right? The higher concentration is going to have a certain effect on my height of bean plants. In this case, I'm thinking that a higher concentration of salt is going to make my bean plant grow smaller. Now, of course, that or not grow as fast, and that actually might be a helpful thing. So I could say either way. That's not a it's not a requirement to say that these are always going to hurt your plant, right? Then at this point is where I go to data collection. I make up a variable. That's the thing I'm actually changing. That's my independent. Then my dependent variable would be the one that I'm expecting to change. So in this case, right, we got to think about what our independent and our dependent variable is. And then we have to have controls, okay, things that we're not going to change that are going to allow this experiment to be successful. Because if you don't have those controls and you just change multiple variables, we don't know. For example, if I put this bean under a red light and then I give it salt water, how do I know if it's the red light or the salt water that is affecting the growth of that bean? Okay, so that's something to think about. And then of course you have your results and interpretation, where you look at your data and you then graph it or put it in some sort of a table. And you should have some level of statistics, but the good news is, for those of you who have taken AP Bio or maybe heard of AP Bio or even stats, this is not a course where you will require to take or to use heavy statistics. So you're not expected to do a chi-square test or a student's t-test or even standard deviation or standard error. If you've never heard of those words, that's okay. You won't really need them for this course, so that's a good thing. But it is important to understand that you have to do some sort of math. And for my case, with my students, we typically do averages, which is fine and clearly okay for ours. Then, of course, you have to have a discussion and conclusion. That's where you think about, was my hypothesis correct? Did it work out the way I thought it was going to work out? Or at some point, was it wrong and maybe I have to return and modify the hypothesis as I mentioned earlier. So that's something that's okay to think about. So a quick little test here. So if you want to pause and try it out and see if you know these things, let's see if we can figure out what was what on the test, on the experiment we just discussed. So in the previous example, what was the independent variable? What was the dependent variable? And what do you think would be our control? Okay, so if you made a couple of decisions here, your independent variable would be the amount of salt that we add to the seeds. That's pretty clear. Because that's the thing that we're changing. Now the dependent variable is the thing we're looking for to have a result from that change. So in this case, our dependent variable should have been the average height of the plant. So we're not going to add, we'd have to do some research to figure out how much salt our plant could take so that it actually does still grow. So this is something that's a trial and error. It's not something that just happens, you know, willy-nilly and you just go from nothing to, oh, we have the answer. And then of course, we have to, the control here is growing the seeds with no salt present. We want to have some sort of a baseline so that we know, okay, so here's what seeds look like when they don't have any salt. versus when we have this much salt or varying degrees of it. Okay, and then from there we can then look at the average heights, and we have something to compare to. So that's how we want to look at those things. Now, the problem with APES is that it's very difficult because we have no control group. There's no control planet, right? This is our Earth. This is what we're dealing with, and there's no control, right? This is us. That's all of us here, all 7 point almost 6 billion people. And many factors play into roles, play a role in ecosystems. We have to figure out if it's this factor or that factor and how humans are doing it. And of course, we have difficulty looking at the big picture. That's something I would say is the reason we have this course completely, is because it's very difficult to look at the big picture to figure out what's going to happen long term and past our own needs, right? You know, for some people, just thinking about what will happen right after this video is something that's challenging and hard to do, right? Imagine having to think about 100 years from now or 500 years from now. And that's something that's very challenging to do. And one caveat I will say is, you know, I don't want you to think that you're not a great person because you're thinking about your needs. That's important. Those are needs that we all have to deal with. But it is important to make sure that for our course that you think about it long term, and that's how we're looking at these solutions. Okay? So I'm hoping that this is video 1 of a series, and we'll work out quite a bit of some of the skills that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to be looking at the science skills like chemistry, some of the math involved in our course, the multiple choice, the free response, test strategies, and I do want to take a look at all the 9 units of the AP exam. So I hope this was helpful for you and that you're willing to stick with APES and that we have a good year. Thank you.